Report story. Nami fell in behind her captain as the crew headed towards the village. It was surrounded by a stone wall that connected to the cliffs. It didn't really seem like it was meant to keep anyone out or in, it just directed them to a front gate. The gate itself was wide open, and citizens were streaming out and in. They all stayed on the right-hand side of the gate. On the other side, there was a tall-looking guy smoking a cigarette behind a glass panel. He appeared to be inside a kind of ticket booth. Nami felt Luffy tense up. She could see it too. The man in the booth, he looked so much like him. "Hey you guys," the man called, pointing to the crew. "Would you come here for a second?" They all exchanged a glance, except Luffy, who had averted his gaze and was staring at the ground. Nami squeezed in between him and Zoro, who stepped out of the way to let her through. As they moved forwards, she placed a tentative hand on her captain's shoulder. He didn't look up, but acknowledged her by leaning into her hand a tiny bit, before standing back up. She kept her hand on his back as they walked forwards. A few crew members shot her weird looks, but she ignored them all. They reached the glass panel that the man was sitting behind. "Y'all are pirates, right?" he asked casually. The group nodded, unsure of what to do. They looked nervous. The man chuckled. "Don't worry, your kind is welcome here. I just wanted to know because we have a special tradition for the pirates that come through here. We call it the game." The others all exchanged looks. Luffy just stayed where he was in front of the group with his hands in his pockets and his gaze on the floor. "What the hell is up with this kid?" the man asked, pointing at Luffy. There was a short silence, before Luffy spoke up. "Sorry," he muttered, looking up and meeting the man's gaze. "You just happen to look one hell of a lot like my dead brother." The crew went dead silent. None of them even breathed. They could all see the comparison now. The man's eyes widened in shock. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. All of them were shocked by Luffy's statement. He had said it with such a lack of emotion in his voice that it was scary. The man cleared his throat. Anyway, if you guys win the game, you get free meals and accommodation here. Everything in the stores is also completely free of charge, as long as you're reasonable with it, so it's pretty handy for people passing through to stock up their supplies and spend a night in a flash hotel room on dry land, don't you think?" They all nodded, Luffy included. "Well, we're in," he said. The man grinned. "That's great, follow me." He climbed out of the panel and turned to the civilians. "You lot," he yelled. "Spread the news. This brave group has taken on the game." The crowd all cheered loudly and ran off to spread the news. Nami couldn't help but feel uneasy about their reaction. Should she be worried? What concerned her the most is that Luffy still wasn't very well. He was still fairly pale and shaky, although he had healed a lot better than any normal person would have, especially considering the severity of his case. The man strode off and the pirate crew fell into step. Chopper couldn't keep up with their brisk pace on his little legs, so Zoro scooped him up and sat him on his shoulders. Robin walked quietly beside him and Sanji was in the front of the group, along with Usopp. Luffy, who would usually be charging ahead, hung back and trailed behind, still upset from the shock of seeing the booth man. Nami dropped back and walked in silence beside him. After a while, he looked up and met her gaze with eyes so full of adoration and gratitude that Nami couldn't help but raise a hand to his face. She quickly realized what she had done and went bright red, retracting her hand, but Luffy caught it in his own, holding onto it like it was the only thing holding him together. Promoted stories. You'll also like Wine for Your Sake, Zoro XOC. 51K2K. The renowned bounty hunter Driscollgrove Juniper lived a life of luxury. The luxury of picking her prey. The luxury of going home with a fat stack of cash while a pirate. My brother's keepsake, Sabo X Reader. 126K 4.8K. After the death of Portgas D. Ace, the Navy wished to prevent the continuation of the bloodline of the Pirate King. They send soldiers to an island on the Grand Line where, by your side, 29.2K 748. Currently editing Book 1. No regrets, right? Book 2. Goman, Captain. This is the third book in my Luffix Reader series. If you haven't read the first two, I suggest do. One Piece. The alternative revision. 1.2K30. The story will be changed but in future. Still the storyline same just bit change since there will be character insert into the story changing the timeline disclaimer. A Second Chance One Piece fanfiction. 384K 8.8K. Complete. Finally, after years of fighting, Monkey D. Luffy arrives at Lawtail and becomes Pirate King. But, he has lost a lot to get here, all of his friends are Dia. Broken Hearts Doflamingo X Reader. 4.4K 325. A woman who has had several adventures with her crew has recently encountered an island that would bring her and her crew into ultimate doom. Losing her captain and her 3D2YA1 Piece fanfic. 367K 6.2K. Luffy stumbles upon Nami by chance on a small island after the crew was separated at Sabayati Archipelago. The two decide to train together, but then comes the warm, weird. In a way, it was. He leant into her as they walked, and she allowed him to, enjoying the moment. They walked like that for about 10 minutes, passing the full way through town. At the end of it, there was a long room that looked quite old. Vines grew up the side, but it wasn't untidy. The man stopped at the main door, and Nami let go of Luffy's hand. Neither of them moved apart from that gesture, leaving them standing shoulder to shoulder. The man turned to face them. This game has 3 phases, he announced, and they are completed in 3 groups. Your captain and the person with the best sense of direction, your navigator, I'd assume, will come with me. The others will be divided in half. 2 of the weaker ones, if you will go with the smartest in your group. The others, generally the fighters, will all be in group circa. The crew divided themselves up, Luffy and Nami, Sanji and Zoro, and Chopper, Usopp and Robin. Luffy and Nami followed the man into the room while the others stayed behind. The man walked them straight into the room and to the reception desk that sat opposite it. An old man with graying hair and thin, rectangular glasses sat there, studying a computer. He looked up as they approached. Groups, he asked, meeting the man's eyes. 2 outside, 2 warriors, 3 wits. The receptionist nodded and pulled a crow out of a cage hanging above his head. Nami and Luffy were led away before they could watch what the man did. They turned left and walked down the long hall, passing countless sets of identical doors. The room they entered was the furthest one away from the exit. The door, rather than being on either side, was on the wall blocking their path. The man knocked 4 times before entering. Nami and Luffy followed him in. Inside was a woman. She sat in a chair in the middle of the room, the only thing inside of it. She looked to be around 60, maybe younger. Her hair was yellow and shoulder length, and she wore a robe of a matching color. Oh, she muttered, clearly excited. Fresh meat. Go Team Alpha. She then nodded to the man, who turned and walked out. Nami felt Luffy relax slightly beside her, and knew it was because of the man's similarity to Ace. Hey lady, what's going on? He asked, clearly confused. She grinned and turned, walking to a tapestry on the rightmost wall and pulling it down. Beside it was a door. She pointed to it, grinning at the others, but said nothing more. Luffy hesitated before wandering up to her and staring at her. Lady, he asked. She didn't move. HMPH. Luffy muttered, confused. Nami chuckled and wandered over to the door. She turned the handle. It opened. Luffy, she said, turning to her captain who was making faces at the woman, trying to get her to respond. At her voice, his attention turned to her. She pointed to the open door. I think we go through here. There is a sign outside that says to head south. Luffy looked curious and trotted out of the door. He grabbed Nami's hand on the way out and dragged her along with him. Nami sighed, knowing that her captain's mind had been made, and went along with it. These two seem interesting enough, the man said, chuckling. The woman just nodded. The two of them closed the door and then returned to their posts. Just after the man had taken Luffy and Nami away, two more people showed up. One was a little girl, and the other was a little boy. Zoro gaped at them, stunned. What were these kids doing here? Hello. They said, perfectly in time. Twins, Zoro thought, slightly taken aback. Hello there. Usopp said, putting on an act to look tough. The kids did not react in any way other than to continue their joint speech. We will be leading you to your next station, they said. Please split into your groups. The crew exchanged a shared look before breaking off into their groups. Zoro and Sanji glared at each other. You better not get in my way, curly brows. Zoro growled. I was just about to say the same thing. Sanji returned. The two of them promptly broke into a fight. Usopp and Chopper stood beside Robin, ignoring the other two. What now? Usopp asked. The children turned their heads to look at Usopp, who began sweating bullets. Creepy. He whined. You three are coming with me, the boy said, before turning and walking off. The group followed without a word, curious as to what the hell was going on. You two are coming with me, the girl said. Sanji and Zoro were still fighting, but the girl turned and walked right between the two of them. The boys froze mid-attack, watching the girl with shock on their face. Cautiously, they fell in behind her, still shooting each other threatening looks. Luffy was following Nami through the long grass. He would usually be at the front, but Nami had taken over because the second they had left the room, Luffy had taken off in the complete opposite direction they were meant to be going. Nami looked over her shoulder every now and then to make sure Luffy was still behind her. He was, every time, which surprised Nami. He kept close by her side, when usually he would be off exploring the new landscape. Nami froze, causing Luffy to crash into her back. She fell forwards, but Luffy wrapped his arms around her and pulled her back up, looking concerned. What's up, Nami? He asked, curious. It's nothing. She replied, looking around. She would have sworn she saw something move, but it could well have been the wind. Better not to excite the captain. They walked on in silence for a few minutes more. Nami was already beginning to get tired, and she knew they would have to stop to rest soon, especially with her captain's condition. Then again, he seemed completely fine, skipping along like he didn't have a care in the world. And he probably didn't. Hey Lou, Nami began, turning around. But she was cut off. It was all so sudden. The second she turned her back, the thing appeared behind her, impossibly fast. Before she could even react, it was pouncing for her. She was defenseless, frozen where she was. Luckily for her, her captain was just as fast, and his reaction time was not a thing to be joked about. As the beast leapt towards her, so did he. She could only watch, wide-eyed, as her idiot of a captain grabbed the beast mid-air and slammed it onto the ground, shaking the floor beneath her feet. Luffy landed on top of the beast, dusting his hands off, completely relaxed. In fact, he was grinning. Nami was still in shock. Man, this thing's hoogie. Luffy commented, jumping down happily. Do you think we can eat it, Nami? He turned to her and his careless face was replaced with one of concern. Nami was still frozen in place. How the hell could anything move that fast? Having lived on the Mary for almost a year now with Luffy and the crew, she should have been used to it, but she had been so sure she was going to be eaten. And for some reason, the first thing her stupid brain could think to do was hug her idiot of a savior. And so she did. Luffy froze, surprised, as Nami threw herself towards him and wrapped her shaking arms around his torso. Then he chuckled and returned the hug, placing one hand on her lower back and the other at the base of her neck. Nami pulled away, red as a tomato, and looked down at the ground. Sorry, she said, embarrassed. I was just convinced that that thing was going to eat me. Luffy frowned at her, before replying in an unusually soft tone. You really think I would have let that happen? Nami looked up at him, shocked. Slowly, her face went even redder, and she quickly turned away. No, she thought. No, you're right, you're too good to me. Nami, who now found herself in a much too awkward situation for her liking, slid onto the floor. Man, I'm tired, she whined, sounding more like her captain than she cared to admit. Luffy chuckled. We can't stop here, stupid, he teased. There could be meat where we're going. Nami gave him a blank stare. Once again, Luffy laughed. Here, he said, leaning forwards to allow her onto his back. Jump on. Nami reluctantly climbed onto her captain's back, knowing it was the best option. Admittedly, she secretly loved being this close to her captain, but it made her so flustered she was scared she'd give herself away. She sighed and leaned her head onto his shoulder. Recently, she had quite a lot of trouble sleeping. She knew that the reason was her concern for her captain, but there wasn't really anything she could do about it. Instead, she just rolled with the punches. But she found that whenever her captain was close, she slept just fine. Like at the last island, and the other night on the Mary, and now. She knew it was annoying, because this meant that her tiredness would get the better of her in times like these where she really should be walking herself, but she couldn't help it. Luffy, she said. Yeah, came her captain's reply. If I fall asleep, just keep going forward, towards the sun, okay? Wake me up if you need anything. Gotcha. And so the pair ambled on. It was only minutes before Nami was sleeping soundly. The further into the grass they got, the more beasts appeared. But Luffy wasn't bothered. In fact, he was having a blast. Zoro stood in front of a massive door. Sanji was beside him. The strange kid from early was just behind. The hell is up with this door? Sanji mumbled. Zoro didn't bother to reply. This is the site for your phase of the game, the girl said. Your rules are simple. Survive in that room until your captain comes back. If your captain does not return, you'll be stuck in there until the game master decides your fate. The other two nodded, then glared at each other, saying nothing. Suddenly, the doors hissed and slid open, revealing what looked like a tropical rainforest. Huh! They both exclaimed. A small foot collided with their backs and sent them both flying into the room, landing in a disheveled heap. Good luck, the girl said. Then the door closed. Robin, Usopp and Chopper had been walking for quite some time, following behind the little boy from the temple. I wonder how the others are going. Chopper squeaked. Forget about them, what the hell is going to happen to us? Usopp whined. They took all the guys away for the other phases. Robin just walked quietly behind the pair, a small smile fluttering across her face. Nothing ever changes with these guys. Here we are, the little boy said, stopping in front of what looked like an old library. Robin's smile widened ever so slightly. I get your little game now, she commented. You're putting the strength of the crew to the test. In a very smart way, might I add. Most places we have passed through so far have tested only the fighting capability, which I have no doubt you guys are as well, considering you shipped our fighters off someplace else. But you're testing our wits as well, aren't you? For once, the little boy acknowledged their question. That's right, he said. Your phase begins here. I will not accompany you any further. Your rules are as follows. My advice is, pay attention. Before entering the building, decide on your brain. That person will then walk at the back of the group as you enter the building. The only person actually competing in this phase is the brain. Other than that, it is similar to a quiz. You have 2 matches, one for each of your companions here. For every question you get wrong, the subject drops further. When the subject can no longer be dropped, you move on that, or you can answer 10 questions correctly before it happens. Good luck. With that, he turned and disappeared into the forest. All right, said Robin, pushing the massive doors open. Let's go. She paused to let the others go in before her. When she stepped through the door, they were gone. Luffy could finally see a large building on the horizon. He chuckled, humming to himself as he sped up to a jog. Behind him, a trail of giant beasts showed his exact route. At the moment everything was quiet. Man, he chuckled. This is gonna be fun. Shortly after, he got a better view of the town before him. It was not so much a town, it looked more like a tourist attraction. The entire thing was built around a giant stadium. It was insanely tall and stretched out for miles. The buildings around it were mainly for accommodation and food. Luffy's face lit up as he smelt the familiar scent of meat. His jog turned into a flat-out sprint, and within minutes he arrived at the giant front gates. It was manned by 2 guards, who looked at him in shock as he arrived. Luffy skidded to a halt to avoid crashing into the door. Halt, the one on the left ordered. You have reached Shanty Town, the site for your phase of the game. Is your navigator injured? Luffy looked at them blankly. Yeah, she's sleeping. He eventually answered. The guard's eyes looked like they were about to fall out of their heads. Why you mean you ran all this way, through the sea of grass, and managed to not disturb her sleep? Luffy nodded. Yeah, anyway, I'm pretty hungry. Do you guys got any meat? Just a second. The other guard replied. He seemed impressed, but managed to keep his cool. Nami stirred on Nami's back. You arrived earlier than we expected. The man continued. Your committee is on the way as we speak.